Members of the jury, there are some things that everyone in this courtroom can agree about today. Everyone agrees that one of Jewel Tam's parents paid Spencer Matthew to fabricate test scores. And everyone agrees that Mr. Matthew was paid to try to get Jewel into college. That's the right plan. But where we disagree, and what this case really comes down to, is whether the state's actually proven that Melanie Tam was that parent, or that she even committed a crime. But the prosecution hasn't done that. Because they have the right plan, but they've got the wrong parent. Now, before I go any further, I want to make one thing very clear. And that's that only one side in today's case had the burden to prove who actually paid for those test scores. And it wasn't us. That was on the prosecution alone. To prove Mrs. Tam guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. We didn't have to call any witnesses to that stand or offer you any evidence at all. And that's important. Because the prosecution's burden wasn't just to present some witnesses, or to offer you some evidence. It was to give you so much evidence that you have no reasonable doubt what happened here. But the prosecution hasn't done that. They haven't even come close. They haven't even provided clear answers to the three simple questions that we asked you to keep in mind at the beginning of this trial. What actually happened with the admissions? Who else might have done this? And what did the police do to investigate the other parent? So let's start with that first question. What actually happened with the admissions? And on this one, members of the jury, there are a lot of things that we agree with the prosecution about. We agree that the SAT scores that Jewel Tam, the daughter, sent to USC were fake. We agreed that Mr. Matthew, the state's only witness, was the person who fabricated those scores. And we agreed that someone in the Tam family paid Mr. Matthew to do it. But there are a lot of things that plan doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you who had been meeting with Mr. Matthew. It doesn't tell you who had been planning this with Mr. Matthew. It doesn't tell you who wrote the checks to Mr. Matthew, and it doesn't even tell you that Melanie Tam was the person who had been working with Mr. Matthew to try to cheat her daughter into college. Which brings us to that second question. Who else might have done this? Because remember, the entire premise of the prosecution's case here is that one of the parents in the Tam family paid Mr. Matthew to fabricate test scores. That one of the parents in the Tam family gave Mr. Matthew 2 checks to do that. And that one of the parents in that family is the suspect who committed wire fraud. But members of the jury, they've got the wrong parent. Because Mrs. Tam got on that stand and she told you that she did not pay for those test scores. But she told you who might have. Her husband, Andrew Tam. She told you that she didn't know who signed those checks to Mr. Matthew, but that it could have been her husband. And she told you that it was her husband, not her, who had been having those regular meetings with Mr. Matthew. Even Mr. Matthew admitted to that he had been meeting with Andrew Tam. So the prosecution doesn't get to stand here and ask you to convict Mrs. Tam when they haven't done enough to rule out the alternative suspect in the same family. And it's not like the name Andrew Tam came out of thin air. He's the defendant's husband. He lived at the same house the prosecution claims those checks were written. So there was good reason to at least take a look at Andrew Tam. Which brings us to that third and final question. What did the police do to investigate the other parent? Now the prosecution came up here and they showed you those checks, as though they were some kind of a smoking gun. That somehow, those two checks for $140,000 and $10,000 proved that Mrs. Tam paid Mr. Matthew to fabricate those test scores. But members of the jury, the prosecution never even proved who signed those checks, much less that it was Mrs. Tam. Because a couple of illegible scribbles above a black line is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And the police, they could have tested those checks for fingerprints, but they didn't. So ask yourselves, what would a fingerprint analysis have shown? Would it have shown that Melanie Tam had nothing to do with paying Mr. Matthew for those scores? Would it have shown that somebody else's fingerprints were on those checks? Now, the prosecution wants you to believe they have proof beyond a reasonable doubt here, but they don't get to show you just bits and pieces of the story and then ask you to stop asking any other questions. It's not like the prosecution ever showed you the bank account that those checks were drawn from. If the police had investigated that account, what would it have shown? Would it have shown any other payments to Mr. Matthew that Mrs. Tam didn't know about? Would it have shown that somebody was trying to pay Mr. Matthew to throw Mrs. Tam under the bus? And what about Mrs. Tam's husband's private bank account? Why didn't the police bother to look at that? If you're wondering what the answer to any of those questions is, you can understand why. Because the prosecution didn't answer any of those questions. And it's not like they called a police officer to that stand who could have answered any of those questions for you. So why didn't the police decide to investigate Andrew Tam? We don't know. Was that $10,000 check insurance for Andrew to make sure that Mr. Matthew wouldn't rat him out if Andrew ever got caught? We don't know. Who even signed those checks in the first place? We simply don't know. And we don't know, after we don't know, after we don't know, does not add up to proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And at the end of the day, that's what makes this case so unfortunate. Because nobody wants to believe that a husband would go behind his wife's back to try to cheat his daughter into college. Nobody wants to believe that that husband would pay to make sure his wife would go under the bus if he ever got caught. But that's the story the prosecution just couldn't rule out. And the point of this trial wasn't for Mrs. Tam to defend herself against a conclusion the prosecution reached ahead of time and then just filled in after the fact. It was for you to hold them to their burden, to prove Mrs. Tam guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. But they failed. They failed because Mrs. Tam did not pay for those test scores. They have the right plan, but they've got the wrong parent. That's why we ask you to find Mrs. Tam not guilty. Thank you.